Hello, everyone. Welcome to Octopus 101. My name is John Bristowe. I'm a member of the team here at Octopus Deploy. Thank you for your time and attention joining us here today. If you've never been to one of our webinars, don't worry, you're in the right place. This is the Octopus 101 series. This is a series that's designed to help you get started with Octopus. If this is the first time you've seen Octopus, or maybe you've been using Octopus for a few days, possibly over a couple of weeks, and you're still kind of confused about what it does, how it works, and why you should use it, you're in the right place. Like I said, I'm John. I'm part of the team here at Octopus Deploy, and this is a webinar series that we do every month for new users of Octopus. Our goal here is to help you get started with Octopus and to answer any questions you may have. This is a live webinar, and so if you want, you can send us any questions that you have through however you're joining us, whether that's YouTube, LinkedIn, or you've registered through our webinar link directly. Feel free to send us a comment. Let us know. Happy to have a chat with you. We've got folks like Daniel here. We've got others here. We've got Partham as well, who's on the webinar. Welcome, everyone. So this is a live webinar. Happy to have you, and we would love to hear from you if you have any questions. This is a very demo-heavy webinar. I don't have a lot of slides, probably about 12, and I spend most of my time showing the product itself. And so, as I said, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them through. So before we begin, I just want to start by giving you some context about what Octopus is, and more importantly, why you should use it. One of the things that oftentimes I find being in the technical field is that oftentimes when you hear about products from a developer's perspective, you oftentimes don't get the motivations as to why you should use a product, which is really the reason why. It's the motivation behind why you should be using a technology. And so understanding the why as well as the how is just as important as being effective with that product. So with that being said, let's go ahead in today's agenda. So you're going to learn 4 things here. You're going to learn a little bit about how Octopus works, and you're going to learn a lot about why you should use it. We're going to be talking about a lot of things around continuous delivery. We're basically talking about continuous delivery pipelines and continuous deployment. And these are the reason why you're using a product like Octopus is because this is a process. It's a technique of getting your software early into the hands of your users, and in a way that makes them happy, that makes your dev teams happy, and so that we can all be very effective at our jobs. You're going to hit a lot of terminology in this webinar, fundamental concepts, things like deployment process or project or even tenants. You'll hear terms like tentacle or calamari or deployment targets. These and other terms you need to understand in order to talk the sort of lingua franca of Octopus. But don't worry, we'll explain them all carefully. In this webinar, you'll get all of that. Then we're going to get into the meat of it. We're going to talk about what a deployment process is, which is really at the heart of what Octopus is all about. A deployment process is a series of steps that you construct to define your deployment. And deployment processes can be very simple, or they can be very complex. Now, that complexity doesn't mean that Octopus itself is necessarily complex, but it means that it can cater to different environments, different strategies that you may have for your deployments. So we'll talk about how a deployment process works. We'll build one from scratch. We'll take a look at a ton of examples, and then we'll wrap things up by talking about how you can integrate this with an existing CI process or server. So a CI, or continuous integration, is the process by which you build and or test code. I say or because some people don't integrate their tests. But basically, it's the way in which you start off an automated process through build and test. And continuous integration is this idea that I want to continuously integrate my tests as part of my build process. And that's typically where a lot of pipelines start. So a pipeline is a series of actions that go, typically we think of as from left to right. And as you progressively move left to right, you start integrating or incorporating other systems. That can include Octopus. It can include other systems as well, like things like Grafana, Datadog, parts of GitHub, possibly if you're using TeamCity or Jenkins, things like this. So we're going to talk about that in the context of a pipeline. We'll do it in the context of GitHub Actions. But as you'll see, this can integrate with Azure DevOps. This can integrate with BuildKite. It can integrate with a bunch of different solutions as well. So hopefully that helps. All right, so let's talk about pipeline. I mentioned this briefly by going like this, scanning left to right. So on the left-hand side, we have our developers cutting code. On the right-hand side, we have our basically the place where we want to deploy to. This is our targets. These can be on server, on-prem. These can be in the cloud. It really doesn't matter. Octopus is quite agnostic for a lot of things. Sorry, Daniel is saying I've been using Octopus for 8 years, so maybe this is for me. It might be. We'll see. I'll get into a demo very quickly here. So thanks for the feedback. So as you move from left to right, your code moves from one system to the next. And typically the way that most folks think about this is in the context of moving from CI or CI process into Octopus itself. So the reason why you might use a tool like Octopus is because without it, things can get pretty unorganized. It can be a lot of manual labor on your part to maintain deployment scripts. And with Octopus Deploy, we give you a safe and sane way of controlling all of that. So with Octopus, we define concrete things like applications in the form of projects. We define deployment processes, tenants, deployment targets, users, etc. Without all that, it's a lot of DIY, shadow IT that goes on in the scene, behind the scenes for managing your deployments. And so you want to use a deployment tool to get safe and sane deployments around us. Features like rollbacks, deployment patterns like blue, green, canary, etc. These and other sorts of things you want as part of your deployment pipeline. And so that's why you might use a tool like Octopus. Now, in the context of a system involving something like GitHub, for example, or other systems where you're utilizing a bunch of other tools, oftentimes what we see is you have environments that are built and maintained manually. You might have CI processes that kick off from custom code. You have you have a cacophony or an orchestration of systems that you have to manage and maintain as a developer, part of the DevOps engineering team, possibly. And this can be a bit hectic to maintain. In the face of Octopus, this gets a lot simpler. You have one product that manages all of this. So in terms of your environments, you can define these things. In terms of your deployment process, you can define these things. You have this all tightly integrated within an RBAC system, and we can integrate we integrate well with others. We play well with others, so you can integrate with a lot of these systems. And so it gives you a much better environment going forward. Now, in terms of how this might look in the context of GitHub, for example, you can see we have integration points throughout. So this is just GitHub, but you can apply this to your favorite CI process, Git repository, code repository of choice. So up above, we integrate with, for example, Copilot. We have an extension for Copilot. We integrate with VS Code. We have an extension there. We integrate directly with GitHub through GitHub Actions, or we have a GitHub app. We can pull from a variety of container registries through a facility we have called feeds. So feeds allow you to pull down your packages, which are basically your binaries, etc. And then once you have all of that, you can orchestrate that through a deployment pipeline. Along the way, you can integrate with Slack, you can integrate with Teams, you can integrate with ServiceNow, you can integrate with Jira, you can integrate with all these different systems. I'll show you how this all works. And then at the end of that, you deploy to your various systems that are available to you or what you're targeting. All right, so that's the high level stuff. Let's go ahead and get into a demo. So for this, what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and now bring up Octopus and show you for the first time what this looks like. All right, so here we have Octopus Deploy. This is the dashboard environment, what we like to call the dashboard. And what you'll see here, I'll explain what you're seeing here in a few ways. So let me go full screen here so it's better for you all on the eyes. All right, so right here in the center, we have the dashboard. The dashboard, its intent is to provide you sort of like an at-a-glance view, a one-stop shop of everything you need to know about what's happening in terms of your projects, in terms of your deployments. You can see we have on the left-hand side here our projects. These are grouped by whatever group name you want to provide. And across the middle here, you see that we have these different environments. So we have environments like development, test, staging, etc. Inside each one of those environments, we have a deployment, and those deployment statuses are reflected here. So you can see that we've deployed here successfully for the project Octopub-customize. It was deployed earlier today. Version is reflected here, and it's for this environment called development. So the dashboard is a really, really popular feature of Octopus because it gives you an at-a-glance exposure to how your projects are deploying across your environments. Now, if we drill into one of these projects here, and I'm going to show you a complete example, but we'll drill into this in terms of what it looks like from a base case perspective. So when we drill into this, what we see here is across the left-hand side, we have all these concepts that I described earlier. So remember, we're going to learn a little bit of terminology here. We're going to learn about things like processes, etc. Don't worry if you don't understand all of this at first, that's fine. But along the side here, we have our project capabilities and elements. But what's really important here is our release. So the release here is what we deployed out into the wild. So you can see our release is a series of steps that occurred successfully. We get a full audit log of what occurred. We can, of course, drill into that audit log if we wish. We can see a running log of all the things that occur during a deployment. You can also get a running history of the deployment. So this is really nice or powerful if you're wanting to get a sense of auditability, or you want to see why did this deployment happen, who deployed it, etc. These and other facilities you can take a look at. We can also take a look at the changes that went into this release, if there were any, etc. But essentially, this is where this is the crux of what a lot of Octopus deployments look like. You see a task summary and you see a series of successful steps. All right, so let's jump back into a base case where we're going to create a deployment process from scratch. To do that, I'm going to jump over to this section here, which is my spaces section. So we have the ability of segmenting out spaces, which allow you to have these isolation boundaries between your projects. So I'm going to create a new space from scratch here. And the reason why I'm doing this is just because I want to show you the first run experience here. Let me zoom out. There we go. So I'm going to create a new space here. I'll just call this Octopus 101, and I'll give myself the rights to manage this space. So when I save this, you can see I have a new space that's been created. If I jump back to my project dashboard and I switch to the Octopus 101 space, you can see here is the first run experience we have for Octopus itself. So we provide a really nice first run experience. Let's take a look at, you can follow along if you have your Octopus instance with you. Let's go ahead and add a project. And you'll notice that when we do this, we provide you with some context here. So we're going to help you define the various things involved in your project. So the project name, we'll just call it Octopus 101. We'll give it the same name. It's then going to ask you, where do you want to store all of the project process settings and non-sensitive variables? We have the ability of storing this either in an Octopus database, or we can store this in Git. And this turns out to be really important because if you're utilizing Git, you can leverage feature branching, etc., in concert with Octopus. So if you want to try out new features, you can do that. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and use the Octopus database. It's then going to ask me if I want to utilize some of the deployment capabilities for Octopus out of the box. These are sort of like templates, if you will. I'm just going to skip all that and just click Create Project. It's then going to say, okay, we have to define some environments here. These can be named anything you want, but the system has to understand where you're deploying to. And so we've defined 3 environments out of the box, but I can add as many as I want. I can reorder them if I wanted, etc. It really doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and create those environments. And now that I've done this, you can see we are now kicked into the process editor. This is really the heart of Octopus. This is where the rubber starts to hit the road. So the process editor is the WYSIWYG experience you have for constructing your deployment processes. So you'll notice if we scroll down, we have a whole bunch of different steps. These are called steps that construct our deployment process. So you can see I have steps for Helm. I have steps for running a script. I have steps for deploying to IIS or to Tomcat, or I can run Terraform, or I can utilize integration with Kubernetes. These and other sorts of steps are defined here. These are the ones that we ship out of the box, and you can use these to do and define your deployments. So you can see I have cloud natives integration here. If I wanted to deploy to Windows specifically, I can do so. The featured steps here are the ones that are commonly used by a lot of customers. Incidentally, our most popular step is this one, run a script. This is basically like, let me take the wheel and drive. And it's basically a step where you execute some PowerShell, some Bash. It really doesn't matter. Now, that being said, if you come across this process editor experience and you're like, listen, there's a step here that I need. I have a special case. I have a system I have to integrate. Maybe I'm utilizing a database, etc. you're missing a step for me. Don't worry. We have this section here down here called community steps. And when you click on that, you'll see that we have over 570 steps that have been submitted by the community and supported by the community. These are all sorts of steps and scenarios you can imagine for things like Datadog integration or Flyway integration if you're doing management of databases. Maybe I want to utilize Google Data Firebase, for example. These and other sorts of steps are available for you to use, and these allow you to do all sorts of things in terms of your deployment process. So that's available there, which is really, really nice. All right, so let's go ahead and create a deployment process from scratch. To do this, I'm going to select the most popular step we have. This is by far our most popular step, which is run a script. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add a step. And when I do so, you'll notice that I'm put into this section here. So I'm going to collapse all the areas and I'll define what you're seeing here. In this middle section are the steps that I'm adding to my deployment process. So to provide some context here, if we jump over here to an existing process, I'm just going to show you what this would look like. As I said, it's a series of steps that occur one after another. So if I wanted to add a step to this existing process, for example, I'm just showing you the completed work. I will jump back to the original, but you can see here we have a series of steps that are being defined here one after another. Now, these steps can run in parallel. They can run based on conditions of previous steps. So I can run certain steps if a previous one fails, for example. I can have these run on only specific environments. So you get a lot of power and flexibility here. Jumping back to the example I was showing before, where we're running a script, in the middle here, we have this section where we're able to define all of the configuration parameters for this step. So there's a lot of knobs and buttons and things that you can tweak for the step itself. So things like, where is the script source located? Like I'm going to run some script here. Where do I want to get that script from? I can define it either inline. I can have it come from a Git repository, or I can even pull it out of a package. A package is like a tarball or a zip file or things like that. And inside of those, Octopus can crack that open and pull out the script file that you want to run. I'm going to define it as an inline script here, and you can see we have a bunch of different options here for me to define this. So these options are available for you to execute these things. If I wanted to, I could just simply say write host. This is like hello world. You know, we've all seen this demo, etc. And if I define it this way, this is what will run in the context of me doing a deployment. So if we scroll down here, you can see I have a bunch of other options that I can define as well. Some of these may not make any sense. Some of them will. I can define, for example, what environments I want to run this step on. So I can be very particular about the environment I'm running this on. So I can say I want it to run by any environment, or I can say only specific environments. So I can say things like, I only want this to run in development, or I only want it to run in staging. You can also change that after the fact if you want. So when you define what's called a release, you can also change that as well. Now, if I go up here and I click on save, you'll notice that we actually have built-in validation. So we validate every step along the way. And so you can see here, it's got a validation here. It says you have to select one or more target tags for this run a script step. And so a target tag is basically how you define where you're going to deploy to. And these can be any semantic tag you want. These turns out to be really useful because you want to separate tags from environments. You don't want to be necessarily defining these equivalent. So you can give these special names and you can define these accordingly if you want to. And so if I go ahead and save those, you notice that I have 0 deployment targets here. So this is another nice feature here. I've defined a tag, but I have no deployment targets in that tag. So if we jump into that, I can actually define those deployment targets inline here, and I can define them any number of ways. So when we talk about deployment targets, we're talking about things like deploying to Kubernetes or to Linux or to Windows or to Azure or to AWS or any number of locations. These and other sorts of targets you can use. Now I'm going to introduce some terminology here. We introduced a agent software here called Tentacle. It's like any agent you would use for a product where you're communicating between 2 endpoints. And we call it Tentacle. So we have Tentacle is a little bit of software that you'll install on your targets. And that allows you to check to see, is the target alive? Is it in a healthy state? Are there any operations I want to run on the target before I do a deployment, for example? Are they maintenance tasks, etc.? And so we have targets available for Kubernetes, for Linux, for Mac, for Windows, etc., etc. I can do any number of these things. For simplicity reasons, I'm just going to define one called Cloud Region. Let's just call this, let's say this is like, my production environment that I want to define. I'll define this as a target, and I'll define this in line here and save this. Now you'll notice we get validation for this as well. So I can select the environments that I want in particular for this. If I wanted to, I can select any number of these. And this is really nice because it allows me to disambiguate these things accordingly. And along the way, we also have integration for all of these things. So I can say Octopus 101. I believe that was the name I gave it. Oh, targets. There we go. And then once that's defined, I can save that. And now I have our cloud region deployment target. With this now defined, you can see here, if I click on save again, it now saves that value, and I'm now ready to define a release. So let's go ahead and do that. So you'll notice that along the top here, we've got this breadcrumb of operations that we've successfully done. So we defined a project, we defined our environments, we defined our deployment process. The last step is to define our release and do a deployment. So when we do that, what we're doing here is we're defining the parameters around which we want to define a release. Now, a release isn't necessarily a deployment per se in terms of how you may think of this. What I mean to say is a release is a snapshot. It's what we call a snapshot of all the things that go into defining a deployment in a sense. So it's your version number, it's release notes, all the binaries that go into it, etc. And the reason why we define a snapshot is because you want to have a safe and sane way of doing procedures like rollbacks, for example. And by snapshotting that process, it allows you to keep those things as a static instance or a static release, if you will. So I'll define here a release. And in that release, I can define things like, what is my life cycle going to be? These are a lot of terms that you don't need to know right now, but it's basically defining how I want to go about doing releases across channels, etc. If I had any packages, I don't have any packages right now, but if I had any binaries, DLLs, packages like zips, archives, etc., I could use those. In integrated Git resources, I could define in as well as any variables that I have defined as part of this. You can see that all of this stuff is persistent. I'll show you what a release looks like in the wild here when you're creating them. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and say I want to now do a deployment. So at this stage, I've got everything good to go. I'm ready to do a deployment. Let me get my head out of the way here so you can see everything. So I'm ready to do a deployment. Now, notice here I can actually define things like, when do I want to do this release? Do I want to do it now? Do I want to schedule it for a later time? I can also define if I want to exclude any steps. So I can say, I've got this whole system set up and there's certain, maybe I'm doing a one-off deployment. There are certain steps I don't want to run. I can exclude those if I want. We also have a feature here called failure mode. Guided failure mode is when it's sort of like debugging in a sense. When an error is encountered, Octopus will pause and allow you to basically correct the deployment inline if you wish. You can define that as well. I can also define a whole bunch of other things as well. So I'm just go ahead and create a deployment. And when this happens, this is essentially what a deployment will look like. We'll execute this process. I can turn on verbosity. I can turn on timestamps, etc. And so right now what we're doing is we're provisioning a cloud region instance, which is just an instance that we have available for you if you're running Octopus Cloud. Allows you to give you a deployment. It's a runtime environment that you can essentially run your deployments against. This might be useful if you're doing any types of runs in concert with other things. And then once this is defined, we get a running summary of what's occurring. All this will be persisted in the task log, etc. And there we go. Hooray, we've successfully done a deployment. It didn't do anything. All it did was basically write something to the log here. So if we take a look at the log here, you can see down here, scrolling. You can see here, there's our hello world statement that we defined earlier. This is basically the run a script step. Hooray, we get the little congratulations. So that's our first deployment. But if we take a look at something a little bit more complicated, like something like this, where we have releases, etc., defined, we can take a look at all the steps that get involved as part of this. So this is a release. Remember earlier I talked about how when you create a snapshot, a release, there's all sorts of things that go into this, like all the packages that I may have have involved as part of this. I may have some variables that I'm incorporating as part of this as well. It really depends on how you're defining these things. If I jump back to my dashboard here and I switch my space from, say, this space into something a little bit more meaningful, like, say, this Kubernetes space, for example, and I jump down here, I can see that if I take a look at another project instance here and I take a look at the process defined for this, you can see that it looks different as well. I've got different steps involved here. I've got integration with Slack. I'm emailing certain stakeholders. I'm running a tool called Customize, which is a facility that supports Kubernetes. And then I'm updating folks in Slack as well as part of those. If I take a look at the releases, I can see I have a release here. And as part of this deployment process, I can see I've got various things like my Git resources, etc. I can show my variables here if I wanted to. So these are all the variables that went into my deployment scripts. Notice that for sensitive variables, we mask those out. We don't show those. Those are typically just a write-only operation that you can do. And then they are privileged access. So when you need to use those facilities, you can do so in concert with your deployment. So you can see we have all these variables defined as part of our release. If we take a look at where those are used as part of the deployment process. But essentially, this is what a release looks like. So there you go. So lots of stuff to obviously see and understand. There's lots of parts and pieces to Octopus, but don't worry, we're going to jump into all of that just in a second here. So let me go ahead and jump back to my slides. I've got just a few more slides, but I'm going to go back into a demo in just a second here. So just bear with me. So as you've seen, Octopus has a lot of parts and pieces to it. You're defining deployments through a deployment process. There's lots of things for you to obviously utilize there. But I did want to clarify some of the things that you've seen already in the context of this deployment process. So in a deployment process, it's a visual representation of the conditions and child steps that you have. As I said before, you can have these run in parallel. You can have them run conditionally. You can also integrate Markdown if you so wish. This is useful, obviously, because oftentimes you're going to use Octopus in concert with teams, and they need to understand what does this step do. And so Markdown integrated notes provides some context there. In addition to that, we also have the ability to do parallel step execution. You can also have certain steps target environments. So if you want this step to only run in staging, for example, you can certainly do that. There's lots of things there. Also, one of the reasons why you use a facility like Octopus is because it obviously gives you reliable and risk-free deployments. So you want to roll back? No problem. Octopus maintains and tracks automatically the previous 2 releases that you've done, so you can easily and quickly roll back if you so need to. You can certainly customize or change that, but just out of the box, we track the 2 previous ones. But you can certainly do way more than that if you so wish. That's built in out of the box. You simply just roll back, and it allows you to easily revert to your previous version. We also have a facility integrated here called Runbooks. Now, the reason why this is really nice is because oftentimes in a DevOps scenario, you'll be utilizing a deployment tool in concert with your operations teams. And those teams often have to update servers. They have to run scripts on databases. And so being able to do those types of operations through a facility called Runbooks inside of Octopus allows you to utilize your release management tool, i.e. Octopus, with your operations team. So any routine or emergency operations you have to conduct, you can do so using a facility like Octopus. If you're utilizing containers, you're cutting YAML, you're targeting Kubernetes, for example, we obviously integrate there, which is really nice. And we have a facility built into Octopus called multi-tenancy or tenants. Tenanted deployments are a facility that we see a lot more customers as they mature in their use of Octopus. They really, really love. A tenant is basically, you can think of it as something that is unique to your application that gives you a segment that you want to target. So some examples might be, let's say you're maintaining a point of sale systems for some retail outlet, and you want to classify those stores or those retail outlets differently. Let's say you have Eastern US and Western US, and you want to define how you deploy to those locations differently. You can define those as tenants and deploy different types of applications to those tenants. It's a really powerful feature. Another example might be something like, let's say you have a community of users, and in that community you have like your insider program, you have your employees who use your software, then you have your beta testers, and then you have the general general users. You can define those all as tenants as well. And utilizing that strategy, you can deploy different versions of your application to those types of individuals. So multi-tenancy and tenanted deployments are a huge win for a lot of our customers, and it's something that they talk about a great deal. Just to remind folks, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot a comment. I'm cognizant of the fact we've had a bunch of folks join a little bit late, and I said this at the beginning, but this is a live webinar, and so feel free to send us any comments you have. Out of the box, Octopus integrates with a number of systems. I'll show you an example here of integration with CI, but if you've got any backend systems, like let's say you're utilizing ServiceNow or Jira Service Management or any number of one of these systems, you can use these in concert as part of your pipeline. So Octopus integrates with these out of the box, which means you can actually export like audit logs through open telemetry. You can utilize a facility like ServiceNow to act as an arbiter or a control agent for Octopus itself. So there's integration with ServiceNow that basically says like ServiceNow has this capability, a DevOps capability, which allows you to issue service change requests, etc., and do deployments, and you can approve those. When you do so, you can actually have Octopus act in concert with that process. So until someone comes along and says, yes, this deployment is approved, Octopus won't do any deployments. And so these and other sorts of integration scenarios are really, really powerful, and it's something we support out of the box. All right, let's take a look at another demo, my favorite part of every sort of presentation. So let's jump back into my environment here. Oops, got it minimized here. Hang on a second. Where am I? Oh, I seem to have... There we go. Sorry, I went full screen. All right, so let me just get out of full screen here so I can show you kind of what's here. So one of the questions that often comes up is, okay, I understand how Octopus works. That's great. How do I integrate this with something like GitHub or TeamCity or Jenkins, etc., or Azure DevOps? All right, we'll take a look at how that works. So here's a sort of typical repo you have in GitHub. GitHub has this well-known location called .github/workflows. This is where you define what are called GitHub actions. Your actions are defined as YAML, which is just a workflow file. It's a text file that you can use. If we take a look at a typical sort of scenario where I'm defining a YAML file, you can see inside here, it's sort of similar to the way in which we think about deployment processes, right? So a workflow here is a series of steps. So you can see I have these steps defined here as part of my, let me bring this full screen so you can see this a little bit better. So I've got these steps that are defined here. And you'll notice I'm doing things like I'm, performing a checkout, I'm getting version numbers, I'm setting up .NET, I'm installing dependencies, I'm doing a build, etc. All these sorts of things are very common in terms of a CI process. Maybe I'm writing tests, etc., for example. Then later on, you want to say, okay, as part of this process, I then want to kick off a deployment, or maybe I want to integrate with Octopus. How do I do that? Well, inside of your YAML, you can utilize a series of actions we have defined. These are actions that you can use with Octopus. We have these defined as part of the GitHub Marketplace. So if you take a look at the marketplace itself and you search for something like Octopus, for example, out of the box, you can install any number, or you can utilize any number of these GitHub actions we have. We have actions that allow you to push packages, Octopus Deploy. Octopus Deploy has its own artifact repository that you can push packages to. You can run runbooks. You can create releases. You can create all sorts of things. You can deploy a release, etc. All these actions are exposed for you to use if you so wish. So here's an action that is creating a zip package. It's then pushing that to Octopus through the push package action, and then it's creating a release, and then it's doing a deployment of this release. Now, you don't have to do all of this. You can certainly utilize pushing the package to Octopus and utilize automated deployments. So you can automatically kick off deployments based on new packages that are received, or you can be explicit. You can define this as part of your GitHub workflow if you so wish. Taking a look at Azure DevOps, I'm utilizing the old pipelines visualizer here, but because it gives this nice sort of visual experience. But we do have integration with Azure DevOps, so typical sort of things like create releases, deploy releases, push packages, etc. We support that. Out of the box, we also integrate with TeamCity. So there's the Octopus Deploy integration available on the JetBrains marketplace. Incidentally, we're the #1 download for TeamCity for inside the JetBrains marketplace. And of course, we also support Jenkins as well. So you can integrate with Jenkins, you can integrate with BuildKite. It doesn't really matter. There are a number of ways in which you can integrate with Octopus. We also have a facility called the CLI. So at the end of the day, if there's an integration that you want to support, and you want to run commands against Octopus, you can utilize our CLI to do that. So here's our CLI. Of course, any good CLI's got a really cool ASCII art as part of the command line, but you can use this to run a number of automation contexts. So if you want to wire this up yourself, a lot of these CI systems have the ability to running custom code, etc. You can download and run the CLI. You can target our API. It's really up to you how you want to utilize this going forward. Thinking about other scenarios as well, you can also utilize Terraform for configuring Octopus as well. We have a bunch of other tools that you can certainly use if you wish. But this is essentially how life starts in terms of doing a deployment via GitHub to Octopus. And we take a look at some of the releases here that we've done. We take a look at some of our action runs here. I don't think any. Okay, so one ran 12 hours ago. So when we do an action run here, you can see that we have integration here as part of this. There's our build. If we drill down in here, you can see this is where we're integrating with our backend, which is our pipeline. And this is where we kick off processes related to Octopus. So here we're managing 3 parts. We're managing a database, we're managing a web front end, and then we've got a couple of service endpoints that we want to integrate with. And we're publishing all of those to Octopus and managing them accordingly. So I can push all of these packages to Octopus and then do a release directly from GitHub if I'm so inclined. Of course, I can do this all automated as well. So there's lots of power and flexibility there. I am cognizant of time. We're at 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just jump back to my slides and summarize things. What you've learned in this webinar, we talked about 4 key things. Talked about what Octopus is and why you should consider using it. The why is very important. We covered a bunch of fundamentals as well. We covered all the stuff that you saw earlier about creating deployments, etc. All those fundamentals are obviously important. So fundamental processes, terms like projects, deployment processes, releases, etc. We showed you how to create a deployment process from scratch. I also show you some examples of deployment processes that are a little bit more elaborate. And as you start to utilize Octopus, your deployment processes can get up to tens, if not hundreds of steps. We've seen a lot of customers with complex processes. So really, really powerful capabilities there. And then finally, we showed you how to trigger some of these deployment processes through an example using a CI process or server. Of course, you can trigger these manually as well if you so wish through the dashboard. There's lots of integration points. I showed you how you can utilize the CLI if you wanted. We have a bunch of ways in which you can target Octopus directly. So there you go. If you need to reach me, my email address is there. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as the kids say, to our YouTube channel. We publish there almost every day. That's at youtube.com/octopusdeploy. A version of this webinar has been recorded and will be available there, so feel free to check that out. In the meantime, I'm just going to check your questions to see if there are anything. Got a thank you here from Krishna. Thank you very much, Krishna. I'll hang out here for a few seconds here. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through. As I said before, this is live. We do run these all the time. So just to give you an example of what this looks like, I'll just jump in. Oh, once again, I've gone full screen. Sorry about that. Let's see if I can get back to, you can't see what I'm seeing. I'm trying to bring back my environment. There we go. All right. So if you go to octopus.com/webinars, this is me tap dancing, waiting for your questions, by the way. You can see we've got some webinars coming up. So coming up next, we've got Concise, who's going to do top Argo CD anti-patterns to avoid when adopting GitOps, 1 of 3. So he's got a lot of work cut out for him. And then we've got this really exciting webinar coming up on the 25th called Platform Hub, a first preview. We have a facility coming called Platform Hub, which allows you to integrate processes, policies, etc. We have process templates that you can use as part of this. If you want to hear about this, it sounds exciting. Check out our blog post, which you'll see a top banner here, or you can attend our webinar. We've also got Matt and Amit, who are going to do GitOps, principles, practices, and surprises. All of this stuff you can find up on our webinars page, which is octopus.com/webinars. All right, I think that's enough tap dancing by me. I don't see any questions here, which is great. All right. Well, there you go. That is wrapping up our Octopus 101. Once again, another month down. So we do run these monthly. Feel free to join us anytime. If you have any questions, happy to answer them here live. Otherwise, you have my email address. Just taking a look at the comments here. All right. We got a question here that's come in. So Steven asks, can I use Octopus to update on-prem hosted IIS instance of a custom software? Essentially, I would like to update customers who have an outdated version of an application in IIS, run SQL Server scripts backup, and the SQL database. Doing database deployments with Octopus is something that you definitely can do. It is something that actually a lot of our customers use. They utilize, obviously, integration tools from Redgate. Integration with Redgate is something that we support. You can do schema comparisons, etc. You can update those directly. If you're doing it for on-prem hosted IIS instances, absolutely. Like Octopus has been able to do this since forever. You'd like to update customers who have an outdated version of an application. So the way this might work is you may have to you have to somehow trigger the application to get a notification that an update is necessary. Now, the way that this is typically done is on your targets, you want to install Tentacle, that agent software I told you about. And as part of that process, you may want to run a runbook. So a runbook would go off, communicate with Tentacle, and say, go find me some configuration values, which will inform me as to what version of the application you're running locally. So remember, you're talking to a remote agent called Tentacle, and you can run a runbook that would give you that list. From that list, you could then run a series of updates if you so wish. But it really depends on your strategy of how you want to do your deployment. But this is absolutely supported. You can definitely do something akin to that. So great question, Stephen. And hopefully that helps. All right. I don't see any other questions here. All right. Well, with that, don't forget to subscribe, obviously, to our YouTube channel or follow us on socials. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, as we like to say here, happy deployments and good luck with your use of Octopus.